Hi, I'm Wayne Jones. Welcome to Writing and Editing, the podcast about all formats and genres of those two things for people who write, edit, read, or listen. My guest today is Alfie Noakes, who's a stand-up comedy MC and coach based in London. This is You Have to Write It and Edit It Before You Can Perform It, episode 226 of the podcast. Hey, Alfie, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me, Wayne.
Yeah, no, I'm very much looking forward to it, and because I'm a big fan of writing and a equally big fan of stand-up comedy, and here we have it all together. So the first thing I want to ask is what I know a little bit from reading profiles of you that about your we're going to try to focus on writing and some of the writing and coaching and stuff that you do, but I wanted to ask also what other things you do. And for example, are you still performing? Are you still on the road? Do you still do gigs and things like that?
Well, I should be very clear. I'm not a comedian. I'm some kind of unicorn in this world of stand-up comedy. I run a group called the We Are Funny Project in London. Primarily open mic nights, though we've done many pro shows over the years. I'm actually an MC, a promoter, a booker, and a comedy coach. So I'll either teach people one-to-one, but I've also created 3 online courses, beginner, advanced, and one for MCs. So that's kind of my major focus these days, is more the teaching and coaching aspect of things.
Right. Okay. That's good. And how did you grow up sort of just covered in stand-up comedy and you just loved it, or how did you develop this?
My 2 major passions as a kid was movies first and foremost, and I was a huge stand-up comedy fan. I appeared on a TV show some 30 years ago about the movies, and the production team liked me so much they actually offered me a job on the next series, making the teas and coffees, picking up the post. But I kind of got that job because I was something like a human IMDb before that existed, because it was the early 90s. And so I carved a niche for myself in the media over the next 13 years, doing most of the film shows. I did the odd hidden camera and reality show, but mainly I did cinema shows and built myself up to series producer, director. So I was writing then, writing scripts, writing voiceovers, writing questions for interviews and the like. And then I changed gear dramatically in view of the fact I was going to become a parent in 2006-ish, 7-ish era. Set up, of all things, the most environmentally friendly car service in the world, and then signed up all the production companies I used to work for, including MTV, where I'd most recently been working when MTV still had music on their channel. And then the banking crisis of 2008 arrived, and I got bankrupted, which was a bit of a kick in the teeth. And during that period of working it all out, I was working with a friend, just running an open mic night just as a hobby. Had a few goes at open mic. First gig was remarkably good, because most people's first gig isn't very good at all, and that's quite normal. And then my second gig was about as hard a fall from grace as you could imagine, and I only did about 8 or 9 open mic spots. But then I started emceeing, and that's where I really found my skill set. Crowd work, riffing, drawing on life stories, keeping the show running to schedule. So I was able to bring in some of my TV production skills to running the shows, and very quickly I separated from the guy I launched with, and had us up to 6 shows a week. And now over the last 13 years, we've had over 10,000 people have performed in my rooms. Wow. About 30,000 spots have been created. I've emceed over 1,000 of those shows myself.
Awesome. And correct me if I'm wrong, Alfie, but just for the listeners out there who don't go to comedy shows, the MC is basically the person who sort of hosts the show. But typically speaking, the MC also has comedy bit. They don't just sort of say, okay, there's number 1, now we have number 2. The MC will have bits in between where he's doing material as well. And also, often, as you say, we'll be doing crowd work and that kind of thing. So it's a nice gig. If you have a good MC, can make because often, in my experience anyway, if you have 4 or 5 comedians, if you get 2 good ones, that's great. And if the MC can really make up for a lot.
Yeah, the MC's before, during, and after. So, I would go up warm up the room, get them laughing with some jokes, let them have an understanding of what to expect from the evening, and then bring on each act. And then more requirement in an open mic room, which is obviously amateur level, is if the act hasn't done very well, which is entirely possible in an open mic room, for me to, not at the expense of the act that's just been on before me, but to still be funny and elevate the room back to a fair platform for the next act to come on, and get some jokes myself. I tend to challenge myself when somebody's up, say, doing 5-minute spots, 5 minutes on stage for each act, until the headliner, who gets longer. Usually they're a pro or a semi-pro in my rooms. I kind of challenge myself to, I'm very closely paying attention to what the act's saying, of course, but then I challenge myself to come up with a joke touching on some theme they've said. So you just say, hey, that was Pete, wasn't he great? He was talking about being on holiday in Greece, and then I'll try and, within a 5-minute window of them mentioning it, or even 30 seconds, come up with a joke to that. So I've got comedy chops myself. I've got stories. I've said things before that I know work, and I can draw on them. As with so many things, it gets easier with more experience, really. But then I'm the last person on stage, even after the headliner, who I will have introduced. It's me that tells the audience we're done, come back next week, tell your friends, and all the good stuff.
That's a nice challenge to do something in 5 minutes like that. It's sort of like it has little flavors of improv, basically, right? Where and same as you say, in improv, they've been through a lot of things, so they have some things that they know that will work, kind of thing. But sometimes you just have to have the kind of creative mind that can come up with something right there, right on the spot. Yeah, that's
good.
Cool.
Absolutely. I mean, by and large, the comedians are, whichever way you cut it, by and large, it's a monologue. They're going through their script in real terms. By and large, they shouldn't be really engaging with the audience unless you have some fool insisting that they should or have to be paid attention to. But they're genuinely really rare. Whereas the MC skill set is somewhat different. Crowd work, more improvising with the crowd, planting seeds of ideas that I can kind of reap through the show. There's tips and tricks and techniques, and this is often what I'll teach, whether it's a one-on-one student or one of the pre-recorded online courses. But there's ways and means of doing it and making your life easier.
I like seeing crowd work. A comedian doing crowd work is I think of it as brilliant, because it involves, again, you've done 1,000 things, so you have some things that'll just come to you, but you're always taking a chance in a way when you engage with a person, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a great American comedian, I think it's one of the kings of crowd work, which is Big Jay Oakerson. Is an absolute master. Yeah. One of the curiosities of comedy is like improv comedy, like Whose Line Is It Anyway type acts. I try to give the impression that it's anything other than improvised, though of course everybody knows. Whereas stand-up comedians, everybody does know in their heart of hearts, they're ultimately, it's a script that they've prepared, and they're trying to give the impression that everything's just kind of spontaneous and off the cuff. And they routinely, succeed in convincing the audience of whatever it is they want convincing of, whether it's to seem like they're improvising or to seem like they're coming off the script.
Another big American who was great at crowd work was the great and the much missed Patrice O'Neill. He was also awesome at crowd work. In fact, a lot of his act was built on crowd work, so he was great. I'm a huge fan of his. I largely recommend my students and newer comedians in general to stay away from crowd work. Like, they've got enough to figure out, is the joke working, since they edited it since maybe their last set, or they're working in some new material. By definition, new comedians, everything they're doing is new material. It's much better they focus on that than crowd work. More often than not, when a newer comedian tries crowd work, it really had no purpose. They'll say something like, hey, has anybody here been on holiday lately? And really what they wanted to say is, hey, I've just been on holiday, and now here's my bit about being on holiday. Right. If you ask the crowd that, you're opening potentially the gates of hell, because you don't know how insane some of those audience members are. Maybe they do answer, and they give you a sincere answer to what their holiday was recently, but it's got nothing to do with the show, and all of it is taking away your precious 5 minutes of stage time. Yeah, it's worth pointing out, in an open mic room, it varies around the world, city to city. It can be different lengths of time on stage, but by and large, 5 minutes is common. And the average person speaks at 3 words a second. So a 5 minute set, that's 900 words. And probably something less, because you want to give time for applause breaks, laughter lines, timing, everything else. So maybe nearer 800, 850 words,
if you're a new comedian, you spend any time talking to the crowd, you've just lost, a significant percentage of those 850 words.
Yeah.
So unless there's a very good reason, leave the crowd work to the MC.
Yeah, no, it's a difficult thing. And speaking of that, that actually segues nicely into, I wanted to ask you about writing. And it's sort of like, it reminded me when I was thinking about it leading up to this conversation about, people think of film, well, really as acting, of course, and directing and stuff. But a lot of the art forms like comedy, film, it's not just books that are based on writing. You can't have a good film without a good script. You can't have
absolutely not. No, the script is absolutely fundamental. Sorry to break in on you, but actually, the course that I've most recently created, a more advanced one for more seasoned open mic acts who are trying to move towards the paid and pro circuit. That whole premise for that course is called the cinematic system of stand-up. Because with my former life as a movie journalist, I very quickly realised when I got into comedy how much overlap there is. A film director is creating images for the screen, but a stand-up comedian is creating images for the mind. It's just delivered through, the verbal process. So they must use much more evocative imagery, but they're using similar techniques such as hooking attention right at the beginning. A great thriller horror movie and or a comedy, they share the same traits of like surprise. Jokes are very often predicated on surprise. It has to have a through line of logic. In retrospect, the audience can figure it out, but actually you're leading them by the nose through, a tricky path, and you don't want them to see what's coming. So there's huge overlap between comedy and cinema, all kinds of storytelling. The overlap is there throughout.
Yeah, and that, as you mentioned, the fact that if no matter how good the actors are, let's stick with cinema. Mm-hmm. If the script is bad, there's no damn way that's going to be any good. And of course, you see some of that, right? Where a bunch of high profile $5 million actors have signed up for this piece of poo-poo that has been written just horribly. And it doesn't matter how good the actor is, that is not going to be any good. And that's just, let me get into the comedy part that I wanted to ask you about, because, you often hear people, and the great Greg Giraldo had a comment about this once about people saying, boy, I've always wanted to do stand-up comedy, but I'm just not brave enough to go up on stage. And Giraldo's comment was something like, do you think that's all it takes to just be brave enough to get on stage? You need to be a good writer, right? You need writing. So for the students or the aspiring comedians that you deal with, do they realize that, or is that something you really focus on with them, that writing is very, very important? Of course, timing is, and polishing your act and being smooth maybe on stage and all that sort of thing. But do you emphasize writing, or is that something that comes up, or how does that go?
Of course, I think it's self-evident that writing is absolutely critical to the art form of stand-up comedy. What I'll often refer people to is, if you're going to get into stand-up comedy, and there's any number of reasons to do it. Some people just do it because they love comedy and they want to, this is almost their new hobby. Instead of playing golf, this is what they do. Most of the night, when they're not on stage, other people are trying to make them laugh, and then they have a drink with a nice new tribe of people afterwards. But it's fairly self-evident that you're going to have to write something to go up there. So for the first gig, I just recommend people just get something down, get up there, pass the psychological Rubicon of going on stage, get past that scary notion. If you get a couple of chuckles, you're doing all right. After that, you've passed that, you can just really start focusing on really the only two elements that count: writing and performing.
That's right.
And so writing has to begin with ideas. In comedy, there are, of course, premises. You have a notion, an observation, an idea that is the platform for whatever material you're going to do. If it's just a very fleeting one, then it's a joke. If it's a slightly longer, sticking around on a subject or diving a bit deeper into it, it's quote unquote a bit. And then if you really go on a deep dive and spend your entire 5 minutes on one topic, then that's a chunk. So the question is, how deep do you want to go? So first of all, you want to go out and generate your premises. There's a limitless number of ways of doing this, but the simplest one for me really would be take your notebook and pen, go for a walk where people are, and look for things that are surprising or annoying. Take notice of those things, and then after 2 or 3 days, you'll have dozens of ideas written down, and then pick out handful that appeal to you most. That's a good starting point for writing. My beginner's course is predicated on the avoid the blank page or screen. A real mistake is for somebody to decide they need to sit down and write some jokes. And if they don't have a great deal of experience, that's a really hard challenge. Yeah. But if they sit down with 2 or 3 days of notes of things that annoy and surprise them, then they're not sitting down to a blank page. They've already got some ideas that they can start fleshing out and thinking, what is that like? What is the logical extension of that? What would it be like taking this scenario but putting it in a very different place? You know, these are fertile tropes and ideas that comedy can come from. And then having done that, you know, I'm very much aware that your podcast here is called Writing and Editing, which delights me, because while you asked, are people cognizant that writing is going to be a major feature? The answer is absolutely they are. What they are probably more blind to is the editing, which I am very clear is equally as important as the writing itself. Hemingway famously said, the first draft of everything is shit, and I think he's entirely correct. That first draft is just good. You've got some ideas down on paper. That's not what's going to go on stage. If you've got any wisdom, you will then go back and edit and take out every extraneous word. If it's not serving a purpose, as I said, you've maybe got 850 words. Make every one of them count. So if a word is just there and it's excessive, it's not serving a purpose, it's got to go. Right. And then your third draft, I would argue, would be to go through and then punch up the wording, make it more interesting. So if the bit involves me saying, so I was walking down the street the other day. Okay, so let's go back and punch that up a little bit. So I was bowling down the street the other day. And then this man ran up and he said to me, well, how about I bowling down the street the other day and this geezer came over and yelled at me? Well, geezer instead of man, and yelled instead of said, bowled instead of walking. This is the same number of words, but it's so much more powerful and potent and evocative, because it is ultimately a spoken word art form and we're painting images in people's minds. So find your premise, write it out, redraft it by reducing the words, punch it up with some more evocative language, and then do it all over again. Edit it through, say it out loud. You will, of course, be aware of this. What scans on the page doesn't necessarily scan off the tongue. That's so right. Say it out loud and go, okay, I get the notion, but it just doesn't have that rhythm, or it's a bit tricky coming out of my mouth. There's some word clashes there. How can I smooth this out? You know, thesaurus.com is every writer's friend, you know. So maybe on your third, fourth draft, check out what you can change up on thesaurus.com. You know, I'm an experienced, seasoned writer, and I still use it all the time.
And the thing you said actually about, just to take the one example of old man versus geezer, I mean, also through that establishes a kind of personality in the comedian. You know, it's more, old man is basically in a certain way very flat and factual. This geezer comes up to me and says, you know, it sets a certain attitude, as it were. You know, exactly,
as indeed should, you know, so many of the words as you go through. You've all done it with bowling instead of walking, and yelled instead of said. You know, it just takes a few power words like that in a piece, and it really transforms it from, yes, you are factually sharing something with me, but this one, you've painted a picture in my mind. I'm really seeing what you're describing, and when you're doing that, then you're halfway there to getting the laugh, so long as your punchline pays off.
Do you discover that with a lot of your, I'm not sure what that term, your clients or your aspiring comedians, students, do you discover with a lot of your students that it's the getting on stage part that they were worried about, and then when they're faced with writing, they think, oh, I didn't know there's going to be, you know, as if I didn't think there was going to be a test kind of thing. Do you get that, or do they get into it and say, oh, of course it's going to involve writing, and they get into it? And the question I want to ask you about is, do you find, as I think there is in right across the board, let's say in books and in film, there's a lot of very, very poor writing. And do you find that among, I don't mean to, you know, diminish your students or anything, but is that a hard thing for them?
There's quite a few questions there, so let me unpack that a little bit. My students come in many forms, but very, very rarely, probably never, in fact, have I taken a student on one-to-one who's never actually been on stage. If they want my help there, I just put them towards my Stepping into Stand-Up Comedy online course. Everything they might possibly need to know is in there for somebody who's not been on stage. It's actually designed for people within their first 100 gigs, so it's equally important for acts who've got some degree of experience. Phase 1, year 1, 100 gigs, but there's loads there for them. So almost every one of my students has some stage time, whether it's 20 or 30 gigs, or it could be 3 or 4 years and hundreds of gigs. I can still help them move somewhat forward, but by definition, therefore, they've got an experience of knowing that writing is definitely a feature. It's a spoken word art form. They all know that they're going to have to write something, and really, it's about revising. Very, very little comedy arrives perfectly formed. It's a work in progress. It's constant revisions. I encourage my students to record their sets and listen to them most often on the way home from the gig. Sometimes they'll find they didn't get a laugh where they expected. They can maybe figure out why. Sometimes they get a laugh when they didn't expect, and they can remember why, figure out why, and then use it another time. With a typical joke, its standard structure is set up, punch, line. And as I said, many jokes are based on surprise. So a joke can be an all right, decent idea, but in the first telling, it doesn't work because too much information was provided in the setup. Too many words, too much information, and therefore when the punchline arrives, the audience could see it coming, and there's no surprise. Therefore, the laugh can't happen. Just as in a horror movie, if you know exactly where the serial killer is and you've guessed already where they're going to jump out from, then when they do jump out, there's no shock involved whatsoever. Which is why over the years, film directors have tried to revamp that trope by, you think the killer's behind the shower curtain, they're not. You think the killer's in the cupboard, they're not. And then a cat jumps out and makes a screeching sound like cats don't ever do in real life.
Right.
To give you a jump scare, if for no other reason, because it's being silent and quiet and they're building the tension. And then just a sudden loud sound effect is enough to make some audience members jump. It's a bit of a trick, And then the serial killer jumps out and they're actually, in the loft and jump down from above. Yeah. So the joke version of that is too much information. They can see the punchline coming, so the joke is lost. Alternatively, so they might go and rewrite that punchline, rewrite the setup so the punchline isn't so obvious, pass down some of that information, reduce the number of words, and now they've gone too far the other way. It's a calibration process. Without giving enough information, the punchline can't make sense. So we've gone from too much information and it's obvious to not enough information and it's nonsensical. And so through a process of calibration, rewriting, retrying, we should get to the sweet spot where there's just enough information for the audience to think they know where you're going, and then bang, you hit them with a punchline and they're surprised, and thus we have a laugh. And if I may add one other thing to this as well, something that many new comedians don't appreciate as well. I think most of culture knows what a punchline is, but actually there's a punch word as well. And when you've done a setup, set up your joke, and you're delivering the funny line that pays it off, there is always a singular word which reveals what the joke is within that punchline. Let's say the punchline is 7 words long. It always makes sense to make the punch word as late as possible in the punchline, ideally the last word. And where possible, it should be a short word, not a long multi-syllable word. And if you want to go to another level, then you want to start playing with plosives. There are 6 letters that are plosives, but the 2 I'll use as an example here are P's and B's. People just inherently, and we have no idea why, but P and B words are just funnier than other words. The words like pump, bubble, pop. If I've got an audience member who's kind of trying to derail the show and I ask them their name, they will, without exception, say Bob. Even though they don't know anything about comedy, they have an inherent understanding that the word Bob is funnier than the word Dave. It's not a surprise that the most famous of the Minions, the animated cartoon characters, the Minions, is called Bob, because it's inherently funny. So if you really want to work that joke, calibrate to get just the right amount of information so the surprise can happen, put the punch word as late as possible in the punch line, and then if you can make that punch word, if you've got 8 choices of what the word might be, they're all going to make sense. If you can make it something with B's and P's, pump, bubble, pop, then all the sweeter. These are all ways of just leveling up your joke, and all of them come through redrafting and revision.
That's That's a fascinating lesson right there. That's amazing. By the way, I do think so. And that thing you were saying about the when you were making the analogy with film about too much of a setup, I hate those films where the music also goes up and, oh, it's not this, it's not this, it's not this. Then the cat makes the jump scare, and then they go, whew, we got away from that. And yeah, the guy comes down from the loft. And I find that the lamest stereotype kind of thing. And that's equivalent to what you're saying about the long setup. So yeah. And there are some comedians who are very experienced. I think of the great David Tell, who has a tendency, you were talking about jokes, bits and chunks. I think he goes beyond chunks and goes to stories. And he often makes fun of himself about that. He'll be in the middle of it and he'll say, God, this is a long way to go to get to this.
Yeah, but he's such a different level comic genius that almost anything he does is A, hilarious, and B, on the unbelievably rare occasion it might not pay off, utterly forgivable and enjoyable regardless. I can't speak highly enough of Vittel.
I'd pay to see him drink water. I mean, he's super awesome. Yeah, one of my favorites. I've seen him a couple of times, by the way. So three of the offerings that you have, and I can sort of infer from what they're called, sort of what they would be. One is an online course. You do live workshops, right?
Yes. Well, I produce and promote a series of workshops, some of which I teach. I teach MCing, punch up your stand-up, and comedy storytelling. So that's the perfect blend of both kind of structures of writing, narrative, and stand-up jokes. And then I bring in other comedians to teach other elements. So Scott Capurro, who won the coveted Perrier Award at the Edinburgh Festival, he was in Mrs. Doubtfire. He teaches a workshop with me. Dave Thompson, who is Tinky Winky in the Teletubbies, he teaches the clowning workshop and the clean comedy workshop. They all happen here in London, though. So unless somebody can make it for half a day to my venue in London, Fars in Dalston, then that's not really available to them. It was really the pandemic that made it clear to me, while I couldn't run shows and most of my students were London-centric. Though I've had people fly in for my workshops from Norway and Ireland, come down from Scotland. But by and large, the workshops are live in person. You have to be kind of London-based. So during the lockdown, I recorded the 2 online courses. You must understand, over the years, like I've watched thousands and thousands of comedians up close and personal. I've seen the hardest stage deaths, and I've seen great successes. I've seen acts working it through year after year, week after week in my room, and I've been able to have the privilege of seeing what does and doesn't work. I've had my own share of stage deaths, make no mistake. And of course, by promoting those workshops, I got to be a student in the workshop, and I could learn as well. And then I'd be on stage 4 nights a week. I'd often take not so much what they said to do, I'd largely figured that out, but what they said you should never do, I would then go, well, it's my room, let's give it a go. And then I'd do what they said not to do and get absolutely abused by the audience, so all right every time. So when I couldn't run the work, the point I was driving towards is, so many hundreds and hundreds of acts have come to me after a show and asked me in the open mic circuit, no pros here, would come and ask me for advice on this aspect of this or that. And in the live and in-person workshops, no matter the topic, there were still universal questions. Hecklers is always a big concern, no matter what we're teaching. So I really kind of compacted those together because I knew what the common interests were. I knew what the major pitfalls are, the big rookie errors, the shortcuts to some of the ideas I've given you here. So I kind of put all of that together in a course for beginners and a course for MCing during the lockdown. And then late last year, early this year, that's when I kind of really got stuck in for the advanced level. And that became a much bigger course than I imagined. I thought it was going to be about 3 or something hours. And it's come out at over 5. But I need to be clear, they're step by step. There's 16 sessions. It's something like 20 minutes a session. And then there's a challenge, a practical something to do at the end of every session in each of the courses. The student should then go and do that thing. And then they come back when they like, the following week most likely, and then go to the next. So it's a progressive setup.
At 5 hours, I'd really advise you to have both a callback and a plosive at the end of that 5 hours.
I have them both in there, but there's about 4 minutes, 59 and a half minutes worth of additional advice. But yes, that's entirely wise, sage advice.
I love callbacks, by the way. Those are
so
great.
To audiences, I make it really clear. Most comedians should begin with their best joke and close their set with their second best joke, or the other way around. But you really want to sandwich your set with a big laugh at the beginnings, then the audience like you immediately. They can relax and go, okay, I don't have to sit here awkwardly while they try and make me laugh and I feel awkward. You know, they've shown they can make me laugh. I can enjoy the set more. And then, of course, you want to leave the stage to laughter and applause. It's a bit icky if you go for a gag and it doesn't land and you've got to walk off stage in silence. So open and close strong. What you do in the middle, that's the new material, the experimentation, and any other jokes you have.
That's a good summary there, Alfie. This has been super, absolutely awesome. Thank you very much. And I hope I can talk to you again soon. I might be coming to England, and I'll try to make contact with you. I wouldn't mind taking one of your courses or getting some coaching.
That would be fantastic. It would be a pleasure to have you. Just let me know if you're in town.
Yeah. Okay. Take care. Thanks for doing this, by the way.
Thanks for your time.